Good evening. Thank you. On behalf of Mayor Emanuel, I'm really thrilled to be here this evening to welcome you to this year's Cindy Pritzker lecture. It's really terrific, and the topic tonight is couldn't be more timely and exciting for our city to hear about the work of the Obama Foundation and what's coming with the Obama Presidential Center. We are so excited to be having the Presidential Center here in this city. Already we've begun lots of community meetings and work, but there is no question that it is going to be transformative for the South Side and for the city. And so we are thrilled to have the center here. There is no more better place, no more better, I talk like my kids, no more better, no more, I mean that. There is no more better place than the city of Chicago, absolutely right, where our president got his start, cut his teeth in politics, made his name, and we were the core of sending him to lead our country. We know how much we miss his leadership and guidance as president, and we're so happy that we're going to be able to have his legacy and he and the First Lady's legacy here in this city. So it's a great topic for tonight, a perfect topic. We want to thank Cindy Pritzker and all her tremendous work for the library and creating the Library Foundation, that it continues to do tremendous work for us here. So you're going to have a great evening. So thank you. You're going to have a great evening. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Linda Johnson-Rice.
Thanks, Andy. All right, thanks, Andy. As Andy touched on, many of the library's current strengths and its reputation can be traced to the vision and leadership of Cindy Pritzker. It is fitting that our lecture in honor of our most dedicated library advocate be held here, right here in the Cindy Pritzker Auditorium. She served as the library board president from 1989 to 1998, and 30 years ago founded the Chicago Public Library Foundation, our private philanthropic partner, and served as board chair from 1986 to 2004. When Cindy retired as foundation board chair in 2004, our past president, Jane Carr Thompson, and Commissioner Mary Dempsey chose to honor Cindy's spirit and unwavering commitment to the library by establishing an annual lecture to address timely topics challenging our global city. Actually, Jane Carr Thompson and Commissioner Dempsey are here. Would you please stand and be recognized? We are pleased to continue this great tradition and to recognize Cindy's enduring contributions to our library and city. We are honored to have Cindy, along with her friends and family, with us this evening, Cindy Pritzker. Chicago Public Library flourishes because of supporters like Cindy and past leaders like Jane and Mary. I want to thank them again for laying the foundation to make tonight's lecture and all of the work happening in our libraries today possible. Now, I would like to recognize my fellow Chicago Public Library Board members who are with us tonight. That includes Barbara Bowman, Jody Block, Denise Gardner, Lynn Lockwood, Patricia Gaten Perez, and Christopher Valenti. Thank you for all that you do for the CPL. We are very fortunate to claim the support of another great civic leader, Bob Wislow, chairman of the Chicago Public Library Foundation, whose ongoing support helps make it possible for the library to continue its vast array of programs and services. Many of the people in the room this evening contribute to the city's thriving business, philanthropic, civic, and cultural institutions, and we want to thank them as well. Now, tonight, we are honored to have David Simas as our 2017 Cindy Pritzker Lecturer. David Simas is the Chief Executive Officer of the Obama Foundation. A native of Taunton, Massachusetts, Mr. Simas was appointed Deputy Chief of Staff to Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick in 2007. He joined the Obama administration in 2009 as a Deputy Assistant to the President, working with senior advisors David Axelrod and David Plouffe. Mr. Simas has then served as Director of Opinion Research for President Obama's reelection in 2012. Following the reelection, he returned to the White House as Assistant to the President and Director of the Office of Political Strategy and Outreach. Mr. Simas holds a BA in Political Science from Stonehill College and a JD from Boston College Law School. He lives in Chicago with his wife, Shauna, and their 2 daughters. Joining David in conversation is Brian Bannon, Commissioner of the Chicago Public Library since 2012. These 2 gentlemen understand that strong, vibrant institutions like libraries, museums, cultural organizations must be a part of the fabric of our city and its neighborhoods. Please welcome David Simas and Brian Bannon.
Well, I also want to welcome you, David, to the Chicago Public Library, although I know this is not your first visit. David shared with me that when you first came to Chicago, you and your daughter's first trips were to the Chicago Public Library to get your library card. So I hope you're using them now that you're back in our lovely city and in the Civic Pritzker Auditorium. So I want to start off the evening. I know that some folks in the room know you. Some folks maybe don't know you as well. So if you could talk with us a little bit about who you are, where you came from, and what it is about this role that you're now stepping into that got you here.
Brian, thank you. Linda, thank you. Deputy Mayor Zopp, thank you. And specifically in Sidney Pritzker, thank you for the leadership that you have shown for so many years around a public library, which, as we'll discuss, are one of the few last anchor institutions in cities and towns and suburbs throughout the country. So thank you for that. To know me is to know that my parents are 2 immigrants. Antonio and Deolinda Simas came from Portugal in 1969. And my mom worked in a silver factory. My dad worked in a textile mill. I was born here in 1970, and the story that is the closest to me in terms of answering this question, Brian, is one of my first memories as a child was when my dad went to my babysitter's house. And for a small Portuguese family, the babysitter was your aunt or your grandmother. And I remember my dad said that my mom had been in a terrible accident at work. In the silver factory where she was working, they were making forks and spoons and knives. And what happened was someone had cut a corner on maintenance, and the machine malfunctioned, and at the age of 23, my immigrant mom, without speaking a word of English, had all of a sudden lost a couple of fingers. What I remember about that time was that in a moment of maximum peril where their immigrant dream could have been washed away, all of a sudden community came around them. My aunts, my uncles, my neighbors, people at my dad's work, but as importantly, they had workers' compensation and unemployment insurance. And so fast forward to my walking and having the great honor of walking into the West Wing every day for 4 years. I began and ended each day, Brian, with a very simple mantra, which was, remember who you are and what you represent. Because as I said that, all I could think about was my mom. All I could think about was the sacrifice that she had made and my dad. And then for me to be standing there wasn't really a function of any kind of overwhelming talent or the fact that I should be there. It was because in moments like that my mom experienced and throughout my life, when I fell and when they fell, community was there to pick us up. And so I feel a sense of responsibility that comes with the idea that I have been blessed with people who have helped me, and now my responsibility as a citizen, in the broadest definition of that word, is to make sure that I am paying it forward. And so when I think about the job and the great fortune and honor that I have for this present role, it's for me a manifestation and a continuation of that of that central ethos and belief that has been instilled for a very long time.
So you have, you had a lot of options in terms of what you could choose as a career, and you chose a life in public service. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about why that path, why that place to find your impact?
So, and unfortunately, a lot of these stories are going to begin with Taunton, Massachusetts. So I am a Red Sox fan. One of the things that would, I think, annoy the president, and there were many things that would annoy him about me, was when he would reference the Sox, we had a very different perspective on who we were talking about. He would win the discussion.
There's a whole new debate when you moved to Chicago.
There's a whole new, as I've learned. So my parents immigrated because Portugal was a dictatorship under a fascist ruler named Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. I remember my mom and dad, as they were preparing for the citizenship exam, talking about being part of this democracy. And for them, as immigrants, it wasn't just that they'd never done it, but they came from a place where it was absolutely forbidden. And so the discussion every single night, even leading up to the citizenship exam, but after that, was firmly rooted in our civic responsibility. And the thing that sticks with me the most that my dad would say, especially about voting and becoming a citizen, he said, you know, from my perspective, yes, it's wonderful, and I'm going to exercise my right to vote. But what's as important, if not more important, as he would tell me and stare at me, is your responsibility as a citizen to participate. And so for me, Brian, it became, the path was pretty clear. I went to Stonehill College, BC Law School, and then I ran for my local school board at the age of 23. I knocked on 4,000 doors. My mother knocked on another 4,000. She was much more compelling than I was. After that, I was on my local city council. Same kind of approach, one because of my mom, again, there too. But it was always with this idea of my responsibility to make sure that I was fully engaged in the community. And so from that first race to those first discussions, the improbable path that I never imagined in my wildest dreams would end up with my having the honor of a lifetime of working in the White House for that president, I think was, for me at least, preordained, with those very early discussions about the wonder of this country, especially in the contrast of what a repressive and fascist regime was. It's still seared in my mind as I think about it.
So fast forward to today. You're now a civic leader here in Chicago. You spent a number of years working more behind the scenes, and so you have arguably a slightly different profile, a slightly different role. So how do you envision your role, separate from the center, but really as a, out of being one of Chicago's newest sort of civic, very public leaders?
Right. So it's a derivative of what our central mission is at the foundation, and all of us have a responsibility to do that. We want to renew a culture of active citizenship throughout the country and then throughout the world. One that's predicated on bringing people, communities, and organizations together to bring about lasting change. So the only way to model that behavior and that mission is to fully then engage, not in a global way, not in an international or domestic way, but beginning right here in Chicago. And so, Brian, as we begin to imagine the work of the foundation over the course of the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years and beyond, yes, we will be an international and a global organization with a global reach, but we also need to make sure that we're doing work right here in Chicago. Our first training day, and we can go into this a little bit more, is going to be on October 14th here in Chicago, where we're going to bring together 180 young people from the community, 18 to 24 years of age. Bring them for a full-day session on the basics of active citizenship, their responsibility that when they see a problem in the community, what can they do? Who can they bring together? How can they build coalitions in terms of getting done what they need to be done? And so me, not only as a CEO of the organization, but also as someone who's going to do the work of the organization, will be deeply engaged in that. A couple of weeks ago, I visited another foundation on the south side of Chicago, the Sweetwater Foundation, and spent 2 hours talking to young men about the work that they were doing there at the Sweetwater Foundation. And what was, and I never, it's always something that strikes me is when a young man or a young woman says, well, what do you do and who do you work for? And when I say, I have the great honor of working for Barack Obama, when I said that to those young men and women who I saw at the Sweetwater Foundation, the sense of pride, but more importantly, that budding sense of individual agency, that maybe began to allow them to see, using his example, what their potential could be. And so here in Chicago, obviously, that work that we do will be very, very rooted in touching and reaching out to young men and women so they can see their agency and then move towards collective action in a community like Chicago with a deep civic tradition.
So you've gone right to the heart of some of the specific things that you're going to be working on through the foundation. And I think that one of the things, when I hear you talk about your work, I find myself asking the question, like, what is a presidential center? Like, how does what you're talking about even relate to? Can you talk a little bit about, historically, what are presidential centers or presidential libraries, as they're often referred to, and what is distinct about your vision, but also what is similar to, are there going to be archives there? Are there, so what does it look like? How is it similar? How is it different?
So first of all, I think that whatever the notion is of what a presidential center and museum was, this is going to be completely different. What the President and the First Lady said as they were thinking about the Obama Presidential Center was they simply did not just want a museum that served as a mausoleum, as a way to simply look back and hold up two extraordinary figures. The two of them said that they wanted everything that we do to be in service of engaging people to act in their communities in the way that they saw fit and to help build community here in Chicago. So here's the example. And I'm sure many of you have seen some of the renderings, but other presidential centers do not have children's play areas. This one will have a children's play area because the First Lady has insisted and said, I want this to be a place where families, not only on the South Side, but throughout Chicago, can go. This presidential center will have athletic facilities. Others do not. Why? Because the president said, I want there to be a place where young people can go in their community to be part of the community, as opposed to a presidential library that simply has not simply, but has the archives of the presidency. Because of the wonders of being able to digitize everything, hopefully, and we're in discussions with Brian and the leadership of the library about potentially having a branch of the Chicago Public Library on the grounds of the Obama Presidential Center. Why? Because libraries are one of the last vestiges of what a public forum is, a place where people with disparate perspectives and disparate backgrounds can come together. This presidential center will have recording studios, will have a test kitchen, will have a public garden, will have an amphitheater in a building and a lawn that could seat between 3,000 and 5,000 people. Why? Because this is an asset and an amenity for everyone in service of the idea of building community. So when you visit all the wonderful previous presidential museums and libraries, you will see a museum that is more a reflection of the past, and you will see a library which, unfortunately, is mostly inhabited by scholars and researchers. This will be an embedded part of a vibrant community on the south side of Chicago. So that's on the center side. Think about the museum. Imagine not just school tours, but tourists, and let's imagine 700,000 to 800,000 people per year going through the Obama Museum. And as they're going through the exhibits, not just seeing what happened relative to the Affordable Care Act or decisions that the president's made regarding war and peace, but also about the history of engagement and prompts for them that when they leave, to say to them, Brian, I heard you. I heard what you care about. Here in Chicago are a dozen organizations who are working on things you care about. You have a responsibility to engage. So it becomes an active, living center for citizenship. Again, not just the rights, but the responsibilities that come with it. So that's the vision, part of the vision around the Presidential Center. The other thing that's very different is that previous presidents, when they left the White House, essentially constructed the facilities first, and then program came afterwards. President Obama and Mrs. Obama said that everything that we do needs to be in service of that mission. So, October 14th, first training for young people here in Chicago. In November, first training for young people in Boston. December, training for young people in Tempe, Arizona. October 31st and November 1st, the first Obama Leadership Summit. 500 people, not to be talked to, but 500 people who are doing amazing work domestically and around the world to come and tell us what their needs are, so that we then can work with them to identify the gaps that need to be filled. 10 days ago, we announced the first Obama Fellowship. 20 people will be selected by the President and Mrs. Obama in January of 2018. I think the applications went up maybe 10 days ago, and I won't give you the precise number, but I believe that we have received well over 5,000 applications for 20 fellowships. And again, what we will do is take these young people who are doing amazing work, bring them in certain instances to Chicago, convene, send them back to their community in service of citizen engagement. And so again, unlike what you have seen before, you have got a center that's dedicated to the idea of community building and civic and citizen engagement. You've got programs that are being developed in tandem so that by the time that the center opens, we now have a fully functional and fully run program that's in service of the vision of Barack and Michelle Obama. So it's mostly very, very different.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out. I don't even understand. The papers won't even be on site. I was talking to the head of the National Archives, and it sounds like he's thrilled that he gets to hold the papers and to just lend them out to you as you need them. I did have a question for you related to this work of civic engagement. It's complicated work. You're leading a mission-driven institution, one that some would say, when you're leading in a mission-driven space, that your impact is determined by the lives changed, not by the profit margins, et cetera, et cetera. And so I know you're a data-driven guy and think a lot about how you're going to drive systemic, meaningful change. Can you talk about what success really looks like and how you're going to measure that as a result of this work?
Yeah. So one of the things that the president said to us, and would always make this point, is that whenever he was most successful as an organizer, is when he would go into a place and not tell people what he thought or what he thought they needed, but actually to listen to what they needed in what they were thinking. So part of the way we're going to look at success, Brian, certainly we're going to be training hundreds, if not thousands of people. They are going to be doing work in their communities. And on a yearly, on a monthly, on a daily basis, if we look out 5 years and 10 years, we will be awash in stories of how young people and older people who had received some training from the work that we did, in small ways and in big ways, changed their communities for the better. And so those individual stories are going to be a good measure of success for us. Let me just make a point about the importance of engagement right now. We are a nonpartisan organization. One of the things that's most acute right now in the United States, but it's not just here, it's around the world, is that the central tension isn't between left and right. It's not between Democrat and Republican. It's not between conservative and liberal. It is between a sense of community versus a sense of tribe. Me against you, us against them. It's not just that I disagree with you, but I otherize you. And in a pluralistic democracy, We cannot function if all of a sudden your disparate opinion means that you are not fully patriotic and an American like I am, at its core. Part of that is driven by, to the point you made, Brian, about data. There's one data set that I pay attention to the most that is the most jarring for me. The General Social Survey, and the University of Chicago plays a role in this, obviously, talks about trust. And we have seen the collapse of trust in institutions, in government, in corporations, in the nonprofit sector, in academic sector. But when you ask people essentially whether or not they trust their fellow American, in the 1980s, that number was in the mid to high 50s. 2 years ago, that number was 30%. When that number comes out for 2016, I have every reason to believe that it's going to be in the mid-20s, which puts the United States on that metric in the bottom half of the way global citizens react to people in their country. What does that mean? It means that as anytime there is a discussion in a debate about anything, without any kind of modicum of trust, all of a sudden people go into tribes. And once people go into tribes, extremes on either side begin to form. So when we think about our theory of change in what success looks like, the abstraction of us against them, left versus right, my label versus your label, is less potent in a community. When you have people in a neighborhood working around cleaning up a park, or working together to reduce violence, or to fight an opioid epidemic, then it's someone I know. I trust you. I am more readily able to put aside my label and work with you. So now think about the people we're training to act locally, with the very, very basics of how to engage in ways that can form and build community. So in some ways, when you're looking at this erosion of trust throughout the country, the answer for us and the way we're thinking about success is to deploy people who are working in their neighborhoods. So I moved 5 weeks ago to Chicago. My Red Sox paraphernalia is in hiding for now.
Keep it there.
Keep it there. It is, when I talk to people, the pride that people have when they talk about their neighborhood. I mean, it's wonderful. I said to my daughter, I said, honey, so she's in 6th grade, and she's like, well, now I'm a resident of Chicago. I'm like, that's a good start. South Side, Hyde Park. And it was interesting because she was saying that other kids were saying, well, I'm from this neighborhood and I'm from that neighborhood. But essentially, there is a trust that people have there in their neighborhood that you can replicate throughout the country. So success for us, Brian, will not only be about the good work that people do of their own volition, but the rebuilding of trust and community that they can through a certain kind of leadership that's about bringing people together rather than focusing on the abstraction of my label versus your label.
Wow. So you talked about Chicago a little bit, and we've heard the president talk about why Chicago, and I'm really curious about, from your perspective, why Chicago, why Jackson Park for the center? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, God bless you. I love to hear the president and Mrs. Obama talk about their hometown. The deep affection and appreciation and gratitude for a place that has given them so much. It's always in the sense of, and in fact, when the president has talked about, with some of my colleagues, and a colleague, Valerie Jarrett, a former colleague at the White House, is here. When he would talk about becoming president, he says and would say and will say that he stands on the shoulders of people here in Chicago that made that possible. Mrs. Obama, talking about what this community has given her. It's just embedded in who they are. And so at the end of the day, It just made complete sense as truly being the only place where their mission could go. And again, the other thing just substantively, when you think about the civic, as I'm learning, the civic history in this city, and then think about what our mission is going to be, that there literally is no other city in the country that has such a deep reservoir of civic pride and participation like Chicago. And so you marry then a deep appreciation, background, in reflection on why they are what they are, with the history that's here, to truly, as he describes, make the city of Chicago the global epicenter of engagement here, on the South Side, at the Obama Presidential Center, built upon the history that this city has, as well as their personal histories. So, with all respect to the other folks in consideration, Chicago's a place to be.
Yeah, we felt that way from the beginning. So.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt.
You talked a moment ago about being a nonpartisan organization. Of course, Obama is perhaps one of the most recognizable figures in the world, and certainly civic engagement in some ways it is a striking all-time high in terms of people out there talking, but in a very partisan way. So how are you going to ensure that the goal of keeping a nonpartisan institution that bears the name of our former president, how are you going to do that?
Yeah. So first of all, when you think about our training days, when you think about our summit, when you think about our fellowships, when you think about all of the other programs that we have, we will be and have to be very, very deliberate about making sure that we're simply not reflecting one perspective. Because if that's all that you're doing, then essentially we are feeding into the very problem. Now, he has a perspective, and the First Lady have a perspective on diversity, on inclusion, on climate, on equity, on responsibility. That is their point of view. That is who they are. But as he has said many times, we need to be open to the perspective of others. When in my old data days that ended a year ago, when we would ask people what speech of Barack Obama's did people remember the most, folks would hearken back to Boston 2004. And all of you in this room remember Boston 2004. I remember it. I had never heard of Barack Obama before. I was sitting at my home in Massachusetts, and all of a sudden there is this young person talking about no blue states and no red states. But the most important part of that speech, Brian, that I think goes to the way we're approaching a nonpartisan perspective, wasn't that there aren't blue states and red states. There are. That is the reality of modern American political life. But the problem is when we stop there. Because the most important part of the speech that is, for me, part of the Obama ethos was when he said, and we coach Little League in the blue states, and we love our gay family members in the red states. It was a call to see beyond the abstraction in the label that automatically makes us hunker down into our worldview and never see someone else for their humanity. And so embedded in our programs, in our ethos, in the way we're building our team is the understanding and appreciation that while we have a worldview, neither side has a monopoly on the truth, and neither side has a monopoly on good ideas. And when you think about millennials, this millennial generation, one of the things that the data is also showing is it's the generation that is not affiliating with either party. They're not registering as Democrats. They're not registering as Republicans. Their level of engagement really transcends whatever the partisan label. And the energy, I think, is in that space. But so that's the deliberate way that we're going to approach it, informed by that ethos that he's given us.
So I want to maybe just to push a little bit, almost in part because I've heard you talk about it before, is how do you do that? How do you create an environment where people from a variety of different backgrounds, life experience, political views, feel comfortable and ready to engage and to learn from each other? Like, what is the convention? Because I know it's a tough one.
Yeah, it's super difficult, and I'm not naive. None of us are naive to say that it's easy and we have the solution. But let me give you an example. So when we do our first training day here in Chicago, we are going to partner with local organizations and some national organizations to help us do the training. Part of the training is going to be driven by a group called Narrative 4. Narrative 4 started in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook massacre. And one of the things that they do is an activity that's all about empathy. And so imagine this. There is a mom who has experienced violence, who wants gun reform legislation. There is a man who believes that any kind of gun reform legislation is a slippery slope to deny his Second Amendment rights. What they do is they basically have each tell the other person's personal story in a way that's deeply empathetic. And so you have the person who is a lifelong gun owner saying the woman's name in describing how her child was killed. And as he's feeling it and describing it, all of a sudden the abstraction of the issue begins to go away because he's seeing the other person. Then she channels his story where he describes how his mom was a victim of sexual abuse and needed to have that weapon to defend herself. And all of a sudden, you have two individuals who have strongly held beliefs transacting on a level that's deeply human and seeing each other. It's the hard thing to do. But imagine if when you're training people in active civics, it isn't just a matter of what your responsibilities, but a certain way to see each other and embed it in all of the training. So that now when we go into a community and say, we have 200 young people who want to do something, part of the training is not only having them tell their personal story, but the ability to listen deeply in an empathetic way so that they automatically don't go to the difference, but they can channel the similarities. This is hard. And we all have had the experience, and my favorite, I guess it's not an analogy, it's reality. We've all had the experience. For me, it's when I'm driving to Thanksgiving Day dinner, and there's that one uncle, and you know that as soon as the door opens, and so what I'm saying to myself in the car is, David, this time it's going to be different. All of you know this. The door opens, and then all of a sudden, all the blood rushes into your face, and you're in that never-ending argument, right? It's hard to do.
And that uncle feels exactly the same way about
The uncle feels twice as bad about it.
Whoa.
There he is, trying to get even with me.
That's great. So you talked about partnerships. You mentioned earlier that the conversations we've been having together about the possibility of working together. I know for us at the Chicago Public Library, obviously there's an interest in having a neighborhood branch in Jackson Park. But I'm just curious for you, why would you consider a partnership with a public library? What is it about that is interesting to you?
Yeah, so first of all, the Chicago Public Library which is not a surprise when you think about it. It is the most visited civic institution in the city of Chicago. 10 million people per year in 80 branches going around one of the last public forums in any community is a library. And so when you think about the power of a library and the convening strength of it, it just makes perfect sense for what we want to do, right? If the Obama Presidential Center is about two things. One is engaging people to act in a civic fashion in their community, and two, to serve as a way to help build community in Chicago and on the south side of Chicago, then it just makes perfect sense that a library would be one of the central features of that. One of the things that Brian and I were talking about before, especially in an era of polarization and isolation, it's fascinating that everybody's phone that we all have with us now is both the tool that can connect you in ways that was unimaginable years ago, but is also the most isolating tool that humanity has ever had, right? You follow the things that reaffirm your worldview. You correspond with the people who are closest to you. You're fed news that's essentially generated by an algorithm based on what you looked like before. And all of a sudden, you're locked into your phone. And the idea of a place where you can now see people who don't look like you, who disagree with you, who come from different perspectives than you, that's a library. And in fact, it's one of the few places in American civic life that truly can stand as a public forum. And so not only is it central to the theme and the mission, but in a very, very real sense, it's the type of institution that's necessary to fight against those atomizing and isolating currents of modern public life that will be central to our work. And credit to you and to the board and to what everybody who's affiliated with the library and the Library Foundation. It is a crown jewel, both for the city and is recognized as such nationally and internationally. So kudos to you and to your team, Brian.
Thank you. Well, and regardless of what we end up doing, whether it's a branch library or not, I think that just hearing you talk in that way, I think that our libraries here in Chicago and really around the country and around the world can be an artery to help extend the reach of the foundation. So we look forward to continuing that discussion with you. You know, we're getting close to the end of time. A couple sort of practical questions for you. You talked about the summit that's coming up, but what can we expect in the months and weeks and years as you're leading up to actually the opening of the center? What are some of the activities that will be happening in our city and around the country and around the world?
So the summit will be just an exciting moment for us, both in Chicago, domestically and internationally. The vibrancy of the young leaders who are coming and their stories, some of the thought leaders who are coming to the South Side, to Chicago, is something that, Brian, I think everybody in this room can expect on a yearly basis in terms of the people and the thinking that we will be able to draw, the President and Mrs. Obama will be able to draw to Chicago. The training days, the one thing I didn't get into, and I mentioned one group, but when we think about training days throughout the country, using Chicago as a template, there are dozens upon dozens upon dozens of groups in Chicago who are doing work that should be nationally and internationally recognized. Success for us is also lifting them up. Groups like MICFA Challenge, who in terms of action civics are extraordinary. Facing history and ourselves and the work that they do to identify bias and hatred from history and then to teach young people how to get around it. These are the types of things that we want to lift up. And then, finally, our work in terms of the construction of the center, the contracting, the diversity and inclusion that we're bringing to the table, the workforce training that we will be very deliberate about, will be so that it's not just that we want to have this civic institution on the South Side that's going to help transform civic life, but that can serve as a catalyst for economic development and growth in that neighborhood and radiating throughout. So it is a big project. It's an exciting project, and we look forward to just be fully embedded in the community going forward.
So it won't all of a sudden just be a big building. There is lots of activities you look forward to in the coming weeks and months and years. Great. Well, really the last question, you're in a library, so I have to ask you a little bit about books. So I am just curious if you could maybe tell us what you're reading, maybe what's on your bookshelf next, and even if you've got a suggestion for us to put on our reading list.
So I am reading right now, it's a historical fiction by an author named, I believe his first name is Robert Harris, about Cicero. And for those of you who have not read it, I recommend it highly, not just given the moment in the United States right now and globally, but just in general. It's a trilogy, and it tracks Cicero's life through the eyes of his stenographer, a man named Tiro, who is credited with essentially inventing shorthand. And so for 40 years, in actuality, Tiro had the job of writing down everything that Cicero said. And what's fascinating to me is then watching the human, very real drama play out between a Cicero and a Cato, a Julius Caesar, and the fall of the Republic in Rome. And as I was saying to Brian before, the thing that Harris has done masterfully is he's taken very real the human condition, and so that you can look at a story that's 2,000 years old and essentially see echoes to this day in terms of ego and power and pride and populism and democracy and tyranny and jealousy and all of that just goes into the vibrancy, the good and the bad of any society. So I recommend that highly. Given my day job, unfortunately, it's probably Sunday afternoons when I can dig in. So at this pace, I'll be done by 2021. But I recommend that highly. Can I just tell one quick story?
We have time, yes.
So this is a promise I made to a woman in Austin, Texas, a few years ago. I had the great honor of going with the president to the 50th anniversary celebration of the signing of the Civil Rights Act. And it's at the LBJ Library in Austin, Texas. And when I walked into the rotunda of the library, I saw these amazing words on the wall: Medicaid, Medicare, voting rights, civil rights, and then I saw the word immigration. And I started to cry because it was the Immigration Act of 1965 that enabled my parents, Antonio and Deolinda Simas, to come to this country. And there I was standing as an assistant to the President of the United States. So as I'm crying, the President looks back at me. He's like, "Really, man, again?" I walked down into a green room, and standing at a monitor watching a video was Mavis Staples, watching a video of herself singing at a freedom rally in 1963. Standing behind her in that room was Congressman John Lewis, who was saying with that wonderful cadence that he has and that voice of his, that what an honor it was to introduce Barack Obama on that day. The president gave his speech. He came back into the green room, and there were 10 people who had written him letters about the Affordable Care Act. The first person in line was a mom who saw the president, and she burst into tears. And she kept on repeating to him, "Mr. President, my little boy is alive today because of you," repeatedly. She then turned to me, and obviously her tears had obscured her vision, because she said, "Young man, do you work for the president?" I said, "Yes, ma'am, I do." She said, "You tell everybody that my little boy is alive today because of you." On the flight back to Washington, as I was reflecting on that hour and a half, it struck me that she didn't mean me, and she didn't even mean President Obama. Because as I was thinking, standing in that rotunda, it was because of citizens in every city and small town in the country who came together and agitated to make sure that the law changed so that Antonio and Deolinda Simas could be American citizens. Lyndon Johnson didn't do that. Members of Congress didn't do that. People did that. All I could think of was John Lewis, a young man in his 20s, beaten and bloodied on a bridge in Alabama, along with millions of other people who led Washington followed. And rather than saying that I had any part in making sure that what was most dear to that woman, her son, was alive, it literally was millions of people in 2008 who said, yes, we can. The work of civic engagement, the work of citizenship, is the most important work of any democracy. And it can't just be Democrat versus Republican, left versus right. We have a responsibility, all of us, to make sure that in the act of citizenship, we are putting aside our preconceived notions, finding common ground, and working to continue to perfect this union. That's our responsibility. So as a new member of this community here in Chicago, and God willing, and Barack Obama and Michelle Obama willing, I will be for a while, it is an honor to be part of this long tradition of citizenship and civic engagement, and I look forward to working with every single person in this room. Brian, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, David. Great pleasure being with you this evening.